Okay, guys, we're going to finish the chapter here. So we're starting right on the last paragraph. One evening in camp, Lewis called Seaman. Lewis was holding leather saddlebags, two pouches held together by straps and buckles. Stand, boy! Stay! Lewis had sewn an extra strap between the pouches so that the saddlebags could be worn like a harness, with one strap over Seaman's back, another that buckled around his belly, and a third strap that ran across his chest. Let's see if you'll put up with these saddlebags, Seaman. The men can use all the help they can get with this portage. Lewis let Seaman sniff the leather saddlebags. Then he slipped the dog's head through the straps. Lewis knelt and pulled the chest straps into place. The pouches hung against Seaman's sides from the strap over his back. Lewis buckled the belly strap loosely around Seaman's middle. Seaman jerked his head around and chewed the belly strap, trying to yank it off. No, Seaman, Lewis said firmly. Stand still. Seaman looked at Lewis. He whined and wagged his tail. Lewis took up some of the slack in the belly strap and then stuffed a few pieces of clothing in the pouches and gave him a little weight. He backed up and called, Come, Seaman. Seaman took a step forward and then hesitated. He looked over his shoulder at the saddlebags. That's a good boy, Seaman, Lewis said encouragingly. Come. Seaman took a few more steps, glancing back at the pouches on either side of him. He finally reached Lewis and started to sit, but he sprang up when he felt the saddlebags touch his thighs. He studied Lewis's face, trying to figure out how to play this new game. It's all right, fella, Lewis said, and then stroked Seaman's head and back. He put his hands on Seaman's rump and sat him down. That's not so bad, is it? Lewis placed a small metal tool in each of the pouches. Then he walked a few yards and again told Seaman to come. The dog jumped up and trotted over. The saddlebags jiggled from side to side as he moved. This time, Seaman reached Lewis and sat with no hesitation. Lewis knelt down and stroked Seaman. What a smart boy you are. Seaman licked Lewis's face. You're going to help us carry supplies on the portage, Seaman. I just want y'all to see the image. It looks like my computer needs to move over a little bit. Lewis loaded up the saddlebags and let Seaman practice carrying them several times. As soon as Seaman got used to the feel of the saddlebags against his fur, he trotted along cheerfully. He hardly noticed the weight of the pouches. Each time they practiced, Lewis walked farther and farther away before telling Seaman to come. Finally, Lewis led Seaman to the edge of a small stand of trees. He told Seaman to stay and walked through the trees and the brush. Then he called, Come, Seaman. Seaman sprang forward to follow Lewis. The bulky saddlebags brushed against some branches, and Seaman stopped, puzzled. He looked back at the pouches, and then he started walking again. Suddenly, Seaman could not move. He had followed Lewis into a narrow space between the two trees, but the saddlebags made him too wide to fit through. Seaman barked once, and then he whined. Lewis chuckled. You've got to leave more room for yourself when you're carrying a loaded saddlebag, Seaman. He started back up. He started back to help the dog. Seaman backed up and darted around the trees, running to Lewis. Lewis smiled. Now you've got it figured out, smart boy. He tapped his chest, and Seaman bounded to him and jumped up, resting his paws lightly on Lewis's chest. Lewis threw his arms around the dog, letting Seaman lick his face. Wait till the men see you carrying these saddlebags, Seaman. The next morning, Lewis picked up the saddlebags and buckled them around Seaman. When Seaman joined the men, his tail was wagging proudly. Coulter was the first to notice. Seaman, you're carrying a backpack, he said, smiling. Seaman panted, his mouth wide open as if he were grinning, and padded over to Coulter, who smoothed the velvety fur on the top of the dog's head. The other men called Seaman over to stroke him or give him... Sorry, I was getting a phone call. Seaman patted the mouth wide open as if he were grinning and paddled over to Coulter, who smoothed the velvety fur on top of his head. Sorry, I read that The portage was exhausting, hour after hour, day after day, and the explorers trudged across the rough ground. Sweat poured off their faces and passed their clothes to their backs. The wagon got stuck and had to be yanked out of the holes. Wheels fell off, axles broke. Countless times each day the men had to stop to repair the crude wagons and reload their supplies. Seaman walked alongside the men in their wagons and their saddlebags stuffed with supplies. The weight didn't bother him at all, but he was bothered by the prickly pear cactus growing all over the uneven ground. The plant's long, stiff spines stuck in the pads of his paws, and Seaman chewed and pulled out the larger spines, but his pads became covered with finer spines that stung whenever he walked. Sometimes the pain made him yelp. The cactus spines pierced the soles of the men's leather moccasins and cut their feet. The men sewed double layers of leather on the bottom of their moccasins, but still their footwear would last only 2 days. Their feet became sore and bloody. The sight of Seaman working beside them encouraged the weary men. As soon as they reached the river and the men unloaded Seaman's bags, he heaped into the water. The cool water soothed his sore paws. Some of the men followed his example and jumped in the soaking their tired muscles for a few minutes before walking back to camp to load more supplies. At last the painful portage was finished, but the explorers could not get back to the boats yet, since they had left the portages behind in the caches. They needed to make more canoes to carry everyone. So the men searched for large trees, cut them down, and hollowed out the insides to make dugout canoes. It took a month for the explorers to portage their supplies and make new canoes, and in that month they traveled only about 20 miles up the river. On July 15th, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready to continue. The explorers had 8 sturdy canoes, 2 large and 6 smaller. Their supplies had been trimmed down to the essentials. The men's sore feet were healing. Sacagawea was healthy again, and Little Pomp was safely strapped to the board on her back. New fur covered the scar where Seaman's beaver wound had been. Now the explorers turned their thoughts to the shining mountains. All they had to do was cross the Rockies, they thought. Then they would race downstream to the seal. That's the end of the chapter. I'll see you guys tomorrow for chapter 9 and 10.